The morning of November 20th, 1943, aboard a Higgins boat churning slowly toward the coral strip of Betio Island, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson stood, his face pressed against the peeling green paint of the landing ramp. The sun had not yet burned off the haze, but the light was a terrible, blinding gold reflected off the water. The noise was incomprehensible. It was the sustained, overlapping roar of 3 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, unleashing the combined weight of the United States Navy onto a piece of land barely a half-mile square. The air itself felt physical, thick with pulverized coral dust and the metallic scent of cordite. Yet, amid this orchestrated chaos, a silence persisted in the gut of every Marine, an understanding that this unprecedented display of firepower was only the prelude. The question hanging over the churning water was the same one that plagued every general and admiral in the Central Pacific. Had all this steel actually worked? The Japanese, defending their island fortresses, promised death for every foot of advance. But on Betio, they had added a guarantee, a statement of ultimate confidence made months earlier by Vice Admiral Tomonari Saichirō, the engineer who built the fortress. He claimed this tiny island could hold off 1 million Americans for 100 years. The truth of that statement, the profound historical irony, was about to be decided not in years, but in hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Marines' immediate sensory experience, the sound, the smell, the terrible anticipation, was the direct result of a calculated military doctrine developed thousands of miles away in Tokyo. By 1943, the Japanese military leadership understood they could not win a war of material against the colossal industrial capacity of the United States. They calculated correctly that their only path to an acceptable peace involved making every American advance so brutally expensive in blood and time that the American public would simply lose the will to fight. This was the foundation of the new absolute national defense zone, and it rested on the core tenet of Gyokusai, or shattering like a jewel, a glorious terminal defense with no expectation of surrender. The soldiers, particularly the elite Special Naval Landing Force garrison on Betio, were steeped in this ideology. Their training focused not merely on defending territory, but on selling their lives at the highest possible price. Propaganda fed them the narrative of the soft, industrial American who would crack under the pressure of prolonged fanatical resistance. Admiral Saichirō's 100-year boast was not just hyperbole. It was an ideological statement backed by doctrine. It was a projection of the Japanese military belief system, that superior fighting spirit and absolute devotion to the emperor could overcome tanks, aircraft, and naval bombardment. The Japanese had seen this work successfully in the jungle fights of Guadalcanal, where their stubborn, hidden resistance had delayed the American advance for months. They had no doubt that on Betio, a tiny, inescapable coral fortress, this principle of unbreakable defense would finally inflict the psychological wound necessary to turn the tide of the war. They had been told repeatedly that their own technology, their Type 100 machine guns, their 7.7mm rifles, their carefully placed coastal artillery, was sufficient, if married with the samurai spirit, to annihilate any landing force. The 4,700 defenders of Betio, a mixture of the toughest naval troops and construction laborers, believed this with absolute conviction. Their lives were the cost, and they were prepared to pay it, certain that their sacrifice would lead to the eventual collapse of the American will. This deep-seated ideological commitment was precisely what the Marines were sailing toward, a fanatical determination that no amount of pre-invasion shelling could possibly destroy. The true battle would not be against the guns, but against the materialization of that unbreakable belief. The ideological foundation of the Japanese defense was matched by a formidable material foundation. Admiral Saichirō was an engineer, and his plan was meticulously grounded in the island's geography. Betio was barely 1,000 acres of flat coral, surrounded entirely by an insurmountable obstacle, the shallow coral reef. The key to the defense was understanding the limitations of amphibious warfare. Saichirō knew that conventional landing craft required a high spring tide to pass over the reef without grounding. At low tide, the reef was exposed or covered by just a few feet of water, making it a natural anti-tank ditch and an inescapable kill zone for infantry. His defense was meticulously positioned for this worst-case scenario. The 4,700 men were distributed among over 500 individual defensive structures. These included massive steel-reinforced concrete blockhouses that could withstand heavy naval guns, and hundreds of smaller, mutually supporting pillboxes constructed from thick coconut logs, sand, and coral. The armor plating was often sourced from obsolete ships, welded into position. Every single foot of the reef approach was covered by converging fire from multiple machine gun nests. 4 massive 8-inch Vickers guns, salvaged from captured Singapore fortifications, were placed at the island's corners, positioned to destroy any approaching naval vessel long before it came within supporting range of the Marines. The commander on the island, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, ensured that communication wires were buried deep in the coral, and observation posts were hidden in the few remaining palm trees. The stores, including ammunition for the 13.2 millimeter heavy machine guns and food rations, were stockpiled in deep bunkers impervious to the pre-landing bombardment. The defense was designed with redundancy. If one pillbox fell, its neighbor was positioned to fire directly into the breach. Shibazaki was so confident that in his last official dispatch to his superiors, he echoed Saichirō's sentiment, stating that the Americans would be swept away as soon as they set foot on the reef. The defenders expected a grinding, month-long battle that would eventually lead to their own glorious annihilation, but not before inflicting a casualty rate so shocking it would force a political crisis in Washington. They had absolute faith in the combined power of their engineering and their fanatical resolve. The Marines were about to test this faith not with decades, but with the minutes remaining before the rising tide. The certainty of Admiral Saichirō and his engineers rested on a critical logistical miscalculation concerning the new, specialized American equipment. The defenders believed the coral reef, which stretched a devastating 1,000 yards offshore, would halt all armored vehicles and landing craft. They had studied American pre-war landing doctrine, which emphasized the use of standard Higgins boats and the limited capability of the early LVT-1 amphibious tractor. What they failed to fully grasp was the sheer scale and speed of American wartime adaptation. By the time of the invasion, the United States was producing the improved LVT-2 Water Buffalo and LVT-1 Albatross models, capable of churning over the rough, shallow coral at a speed of about 4 knots. The American industrial output meant that, despite initial skepticism from planners, enough of these Amtracs were available to serve as the lead assault wave, carrying the first wave of Marines directly onto the beach, theoretically bypassing the worst of the killing zone. The Japanese intelligence focused heavily on their own defensive strength, and the political rhetoric of Gyokusai had discounted the enemy's ability to manufacture a specialized solution for every geographical obstacle. Furthermore, the sheer, unrelenting material disparity was a fact the Japanese command often chose to ignore. The 2nd Marine Division alone carried more sustained firepower than was available to the entire Japanese 31st Division operating on the Asian mainland. The American naval bombardment was comprised of guns firing shells ranging from 5-inch to 16-inch caliber, delivering an unprecedented weight of metal that fundamentally altered the landscape. This was not a limited engagement. It was an industrial siege. The Japanese defenders, trained to believe that their thick-walled blockhouses were invincible against anything less than a direct hit from a 14-inch battleship gun, were about to face a truth hidden in the specifications of the American arsenal. The U.S. Army's M4 Sherman tank, of which several specialized versions were afloat, was a machine the Japanese Type 95 Heigo tank simply could not compete with. The Sherman mounted a 75mm main gun, and its frontal armor was approximately 2 inches thick. The thin armor of the Japanese tanks, designed to defeat only the older 37mm guns, would be obliterated instantly. The specific units that landed, the 2nd and 8th Marine Regiments, were not simply infantry. They were a meticulously organized fighting force equipped with flamethrowers, demolition charges, bazookas, and detailed intelligence. Intelligence that, while flawed on the tide prediction, was absolutely precise on the locations of the 8-inch coastal defense guns, allowing them to be targeted with extreme prejudice in the opening minutes of the bombardment. The scale of the assault was the material embodiment of the American will, a reality that exceeded the Japanese concept of million Americans. The collision of Admiral Saichirō's confidence and the American industrial reality began precisely at 0830 hours on November 20th, 1943. It was a moment dictated by the lunar cycle, but immediately corrupted by human error. The Japanese, watching the water recede, knew the tide was dangerously low, leaving the entire reef exposed. They assumed the Americans would delay or abort. Instead, the first wave of Amtracs, the specialized armored vehicles, began churning their way over the coral, proving the Japanese engineers' core geographical assumption to be flawed. The Americans had built a machine to defeat their reef. But then came the second wave, the standard landing craft, the Higgins boats, carrying the essential support and heavy weapons. The flaw in American intelligence, the miscalculation of the tide, became fatally apparent. The boats ground to a sickening, permanent halt, still 1,000 yards from the beach. The Marines were forced to disembark into the chest-deep water, precisely where Saichirō had placed his kill zone. The Japanese machine guns opened up with coordinated, interlocking fire. It was not a battle. It was a massacre in slow motion. The fire was so intense, the volume of shells and bullets so overwhelming, that it created plumes of water all around the advancing men. The official record of casualties from that first hour is a terrifying catalog of names and numbers. In the 2nd Marine Regiment, advancing through the center, 85% of the company commanders were either killed or wounded. Yet the Japanese experienced their own psychological shock. They had expected an orderly advance by the American fleet, followed by a confused withdrawal after the first casualties. Instead, despite the catastrophic losses, the Marines kept walking. They saw men being hit, sinking into the water, and yet the line behind them kept coming. This was the first, undeniable proof that the Japanese spiritual concept of Gyokusai was met by a material, industrialized determination that did not break under fire. Colonel David Shoup, the landing force commander on the beach, broadcast a transmission that captured the absolute chaos and the refusal to yield. He radioed back, "Issue in doubt. Too many casualties. Practically all my officers gone. Cannot take the objective." However, just 30 minutes later, when asked if he needed reinforcements, Shoup sent his famous, defiant reply, "We are still on the shore. We'll need more Amtracs." His words, "We are still on the shore," were the turning point. They signified the rejection of Saichirō's prediction. The Marines were supposed to be stopped by the water, the wire, and the guns. They were not. They had breached the impossible geographical defense, and now the battle was reduced to a brutal, close-quarters slugfest against the coconut log fortresses. The sheer volume of incoming American fire had not silenced the guns, but the sheer, overwhelming material flood of American men and machines now ashore would do what the shells could not. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The true moment of psychological collapse for the Japanese was not when the American machine guns fired, but when they realized the American logistical abundance was infinite. The Japanese defenders were trained to fight until their ammunition was exhausted, relying on the notion that the attackers would eventually run low on supplies or retreat to reorganize. On Betio, the opposite occurred. Even as the American assault companies were decimated on the Coral, the equipment and the fighting ability of the U.S. forces continued to increase. The Marines brought ashore their M4 Sherman tanks, some equipped with bulldozer blades, and their heavy artillery pieces. The Japanese 37mm anti-tank guns, which had been concealed beneath logs and concrete, fired at the Shermans with zero effect. The Japanese shells simply glanced off the thick, sloped frontal armor, or worse, created small, insignificant dents. The American tankers, by contrast, returned fire with the 75mm high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. When a Sherman round hit a coconut log pillbox, the structure didn't just break. It detonated, ripping the logs apart and collapsing the entire defense inward, incinerating the crew inside. This was a direct, undeniable material lesson. The Japanese defense was fundamentally obsolete. It was built to withstand the weapons of the last war, not the industrial scale of the present one. The psychological disparity was stark. The Japanese were defending with their bodies. The Americans were attacking behind metal. The defenders' final terrible realization came during the night of November 22nd. They watched as American supply ships kept arriving, pouring men, ammunition, water, and replacement parts onto the beachhead. The Japanese had expected a siege of attrition, relying on the Americans' logistical lifeline to be tenuous. Instead, the Americans treated the captured beachhead as a fully functioning port, organizing artillery fire from the shore, maintaining radio communication, and even bringing ashore portable hospitals. The Japanese, by contrast, were running desperately low on water and medical supplies. They could only observe and wait. The final desperate expression of the Japanese ideology, the Banzai Charge, was launched in the pre-dawn hours of November 23rd. Hundreds of men, driven by thirst, panic, and an absolute adherence to the imperial code, burst from the ruins of their bunkers, armed with swords and bayonets. It was a suicidal rush, a final, futile attempt by the Japanese spirit to defeat the American machine. The Marines, anticipating this, simply cut them down with coordinated, pre-sighted machine gun and rifle fire. The charge accomplished nothing except the final destruction of the fighting garrison. When the island was secured just a few hours later, the victory was defined not by a surrender but by a silence. The Marines had defeated Saichirō's fortress in 76 hours, demonstrating that the industrial reality of the United States trumped the most fanatical defense doctrine ever conceived. The silence that fell over Betio on the afternoon of November 23, 1943, was the silence of total annihilation. Admiral Saichirō's claim of a 100-year defense had been answered in 3 days, but the cost was staggering. The 2nd Marine Division, the unit tasked with the seizure, suffered over 3,300 casualties, including 1,063 killed in action in those 76 hours. The rate of loss was nearly 1/3 of the assault force, a blood price that shocked the American public and military planners alike. When the initial reports and photographs of the corpses washing up on the coral reef reached the mainland, the sheer scale of the horror forced an immediate public reckoning. The military censors, accustomed to sanitizing the war, briefly allowed the full, unvarnished truth of the carnage to be seen. This was the immediate, grim legacy of Tarawa, a proof that while the American machine could defeat the Japanese spirit, it could not do so cheaply. The psychological impact on the Marine Corps was permanent. The lessons learned in that crucible, the critical need for specialized amphibious tractors, the absolute necessity of overwhelming close air support, and the flaw in relying on unpredictable tides, immediately altered the strategy for every subsequent Pacific invasion. The Marines developed new, heavily armored LVT variants, increased the pre-landing bombardment window to days instead of hours, and perfected the technique of using flamethrower and demolition teams to surgically clear pillboxes from the rear. The Japanese, for their part, also absorbed the bitter truth. Those rare Japanese prisoners who survived, many of whom were Korean laborers rather than front-line naval troops, spoke not of courage, but of the terrifying power of the American shell. They had believed their fortifications were invincible, and the trauma of watching those fortifications crumble under 75mm fire was absolute. However, the Japanese military high command chose to view the battle not as a failure of engineering, but as a victory of spirit, claiming that the immense American casualties validated the Gyokusai doctrine. This intellectual and spiritual refusal to accept the material truth would doom the remaining garrisons across the Pacific, setting the stage for even bloodier defenses on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the objective became not to stop the Americans, but simply to maximize the body count. The ultimate significance of the Battle of Tarawa lies not in its immediate strategic value, but in its role as a brutal, necessary laboratory for the final 2 years of the Pacific War. Before Betio, the American military command still harbored some hope that island fortresses could be neutralized primarily by naval bombardment, minimizing the need for heavy infantry losses. Tarawa irrevocably shattered this belief. The battle proved that the Japanese, even in small, confined spaces, were masters of creating mutually supporting defenses that survived aerial and naval shelling. The only way to remove them was man-to-man, using specialized tools like the M2 flamethrower and concentrated demolition charges. The casualties forced the development of the high-speed deployment of ground artillery, ensuring that when the Marines landed on Kwajalein and Eniwetok in 1944, they could immediately bring heavier support weapons ashore to suppress the inevitable counterfire. Logistically, the failure of the Higgins boats on the coral reef led directly to the prioritization of LVT production and the development of the specialized amphibious DUKW truck, ensuring that men and supplies could traverse both water and coral without relying on the lunar cycle. The psychological impact on the surviving Marines of the 2nd Division was profound. They had endured the worst that the Japanese defensive genius could throw at them and survived. This shared, searing experience forged an unbreakable bond and a grim confidence that would carry them through the rest of the war. They had been exposed to the full terror of Saichirō's boast and they had conquered it in under 4 days. The lessons learned in those bloody 76 hours were immediately integrated into the planning for every operation that followed, from the Marianas to the Philippines. The efficiency of American landings increased dramatically, not because the Japanese resistance lessened, but because the American military machine finally understood the specific physical and psychological parameters of island warfare. Tarawa was, in essence, the required terrible tuition fee paid by the United States to learn how to fight the Japanese to final victory in the unforgiving environment of the Central Pacific. The price was immense, but the resulting tactical mastery fundamentally shortened the war. The final irony of Tarawa returns us to the voice of Vice Admiral Saichirō. His calculation was mathematically sound within the parameters of early 1940s military technology. He built a defense designed to defeat the conventional landing assault, leveraging the geography of the reef and the limited range of existing landing craft. He factored in the American aversion to high casualties and the reliance on firepower. But he fundamentally failed to account for two crucial, uniquely American factors. First, the infinite, accelerating industrial capacity of the United States to rapidly invent and mass-produce the LVT to bypass the Reef, the flamethrower to neutralize the pillbox, and the Sherman tank to ignore the anti-tank gun. The material superiority was not linear, it was exponential. Second, Saichirō discounted the simple, brutal determination of the American infantrymen. The Marines who waited ashore under that catastrophic fire, men who had seen their comrades vaporized in the water, did not retreat. They did not break. They kept moving step by bloody step until the 1,000 yards of reef was crossed and the impassable beach was taken. Admiral Saichirō had laughed, confident that 1 million Americans could not take Betio in 100 years. The American reply was delivered by the 2nd Marine Division in a shocking demonstration of overwhelming force and personal courage that took only 76 hours. The result was the complete annihilation of the Japanese garrison and the permanent shattering of the Japanese myth of the invincible island fortress. The cost was terrible, but the truth it revealed, that industrial might and relentless advance would ultimately prevail over any spiritual or material defense, irrevocably sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire. The laughter died on the coral, replaced by the silence of absolute victory and the profound, enduring legacy of the men who paid the price for that truth. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.